Welcome to the Prescription Strength Podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Lynette Hewitt, GP and personal trainer, bringing you health and strength without the hype. Thanks for listening. Hi, Sally. Sally's joined me for an episode of the Prescription Strength Podcast to talk about the thorny topic of vaping and smoking in teenagers. Because, Sally, you represent a program that is evidence-based and shown to be beneficial in tackling this growing problem, which we can go on and talk about in a little while. But before we get into it, we probably need to set out the reality of the scale of the problem and why it's come about, and how this conversation has come about as well, which I think would be good for people to
thanks,
hear.
Lynette, and thanks for inviting me on the podcast. As you know, the reason I contacted you was because I follow you on social media and listen to your podcast, and you're a GP, which lends that credibility to this conversation, because everything we do is evidence-based, and it's important that people who we work with and talk to have the same type of view in terms of what's actually effective, because we know with young people there's lots of information out there around vaping and smoking, but actually we want programs for schools to be effective and to work.
Yeah. And if I give an overview of my helicopter view of what the situation is, as a parent, it seems to me as though most teenagers seem to think vaping is quite cool. My daughter's words to me at the point of finishing GCSEs was, well, there's me and a couple of mates and we're the only people not vaping. Everybody's vaping in the toilets. And as those teenagers move into their later years, even those who would have been really against smoking seem to still see vaping as okay, less harmful. And I don't feel necessarily as a doctor that we've got a handle on this. And it was only 10, 15 years ago that as doctors, as GPs anyway, we were steering smokers towards vaping because it's better than smoking. And there are really no positives to smoking, as I'm sure you'll agree. But what we didn't see downstream was that people would just vape for vaping's sake. So it started out obviously as a step down, a reasonable step down from cigarette smoking, but it's become a world in itself. So with thought to the project that you're involved with and what you know about the statistics, I think it would be helpful to get your view on what is the landscape out there.
You make some good points there, because I think there's a lot of misinformation around about vaping, especially amongst parents. I know that probably when you're talking a long, long time ago, 10, 15 years ago, someone actually referred to vaping in the media as safe. It was seen as a safe or safer alternative to smoking. And what we actually know is that whilst vaping is less harmful, it's not harmless. That's the phrase we'd use. And it has been a step change for supporting smokers to give up smoking, but it's definitely not something that anyone should just take up as a routine pastime or as a risk behaviour. It's still a risky behaviour if you're a young person and you're not trying to give up smoking.
If we think back to the smoking data, any lifelong smokers that I've spoken to always started as teenagers. We know, don't we, that that's a stage of life where some of the behaviours you pick up can stay with you for decades. It's pretty unusual to meet somebody who takes up smoking as a 30-year-old. Not impossible. And I guess what we haven't got yet is those decades of data available to us for vaping, which I guess makes sense that we never quite know the downstream consequences of anything, do we? But is that partly why this, the project, do you want to introduce the project actually? Because it might make sense then as we refer back to what intent is.
So intent is a vaping and smoking prevention program. It's developed from research that came out of the University of Leeds in 2018-19, so quite current in research terms. And the USP of intent is that it combines information with behaviour change, because as adults, we all know to eat 5 a day, to exercise 5 times a week, to be moderate with alcohol. It's actually applying that information to our day-to-day lives that's a challenge. So we are doing early intervention, with young people in years 7 to 10 of secondary school, giving them accurate current information around the risks of vaping and smoking, and actually doing an exercise with them so that they find it easier to refuse vapes and cigarettes when offered.
Okay. So, what do we know about the actual environment for vaping in schools at the
Mhm.
moment? Because, as I say, I've got the reports from my daughter that it's going on in the toilets and it's everywhere. You see the disposable bits here, there, and everywhere near the school gates. Have we got any data on what
Yeah,
things are
we know
like?
from ASH that an estimated 1.1 million 11 to 17-year-olds have tried vaping. That doesn't mean they'll go on to become
Right.
regular vapors, but it's still a big concern, obviously. And we know that around 400,000 11 to 17-year-olds currently vape. So, again, a not insignificant number, with daily vaping estimated for about 160,000 of those young people are vaping every single day. Going back to what you said, we know that most people start vaping or smoking before the age of 18, and that years 7 and 8 in secondary school are still labeled as pre experimentation. So that's the crucial point at which to get involved when those young people are either experimenting or thinking about trying vapes. And thinking about your daughter, we do know that there's this misperception around young people thinking everybody does it. It's probably been the same when you were a younger person, and when I was. You see it in the people you look up to, you
Mm,
see it in friendship groups, you see it on social media. So it gives an impression that more young
mm.
people do that behavior than is actually factually true.
Yeah, and I guess we've got to remember what's going on in the teenage brain at that stage of life. And everything is
Mhm.
about fitting in and being accepted. Because to be outside of the troop at that life stage, you are an outsider, you're a weirdo, you're not cool. And I think we perhaps as adults have a tendency to forget just how strong that drive is. And I'm guessing perhaps it's that is a big player in why this is such a contagious
Yeah,
behavior.
absolutely. And it is,
Mm,
when we talk to young people about vaping and tobacco, we're very much looking for hooks that aren't just health related. They're not just born out of adult behavior choices and knowledge. We're trying to put relatable content in front of young people, and also trying to build resilience by looking at how do you actually make the right choice for you in spite of that pressure and influence all around
mm,
you, and drawing young people's attention to
mm,
the fact that lots and lots of people do make good choices. Lots of people in the public eye. We talk about Marcus Rashford, Ellie Simmons, Harry Potter, people who had a challenging start in life but didn't go on to indulge in lots and lots of risk behaviors. So we're trying to denormalize vaping and smoking, if you like, but acknowledging, I think it's important to acknowledge that there are lots of things about vaping that appeal to young people. We have to understand that, don't we?
how do they fund it a lot of the time? I mean, kids in year 7, in year 8, and for anybody who isn't aware, that's your kind of 12 to 14-year-olds, really. They tend not to have too much of an income. Have you got a feel for how
I
this
know,
is
it's
being funded?
amazing, isn't it? When I was at school, I'd have loved to have had the money to do things like this. I think sometimes it's illicit vapes or illegal vapes that are obviously cheaper and
Mm,
still accessible. We like to think we legislate these things away from young people, but where there's a will, there's a way. We know anecdotally that sometimes parents provide vapes from a good place because they don't want their young people to start smoking, so they would prefer them to vape. And on the topic actually of parents, we also know that parents tend to expect school to deal with vaping. They feel it's that's
mm,
a better arena to stop their kids from doing
mm.
it. And possibly older young people buying vapes for teenagers. We know there's
Yeah,
there's an emerging link between
yeah.
child criminal exploitation and vaping, in terms of using vapes as a conduit to get children involved, maybe in slightly more sinister things.
Mm. Oh God, that's a whole topic
Mhm.
in and of itself, isn't it? Okay, so schools have got a massive problem to deal with, but just because you touched upon the legislation there, and there's sometimes when I come back from a particular way from work, and the traffic tends to build up at a certain point in the road, and I look left, and there is a vape shop that's appeared in this little row of shops, and it's very colourful and very hard to miss. And it's very interesting, isn't it, when you contrast that with what's happened with cigarettes. They are now behind a screen. You can't even see them, even if you're just, paying for your pint of milk or whatever. Do you think the legislation needs to catch up, or is it lagging behind really the bigger issue?
Yeah, I
Any
think it
thoughts
will
on that?
catch up. I think, in spite of what tobacco companies say about packaging doesn't make a difference, I think vapes ultimately will become a plain packaged item. It wouldn't surprise me if in the future they become prescription only, or certainly something you buy from a pharmacy as an aid to stop smoking, not something that's freely available on the high street. And we know that at
Mm.
the moment, shopkeepers can be fined, I think, £2,500 for selling vapes to underage young people. But I don't think that goes far enough when you see the number of young people who are vaping, they're still accessing vapes.
Yeah. And, there's lots of things that aren't legal that still end up in general circulation being consumed. Alcohol, for one. It's illegal to buy alcohol under the age of
Yeah.
18, but it doesn't stop it changing hands. So it's probably not realistic to think that just legislation alone. And I think sometimes, I don't know what your thoughts are on this, but something being too forbidden can make it more appealing with certain young people when they've got that rebellious streak or that need to defy authority. And you must pick up a flavour of that when you're in schools talking to
Yeah, that
people.
all or nothing mentality isn't hugely helpful with young people. I know that my son, who
Mm.
is nearly 10, he will benefit hugely from the tobacco and vapes bill in that he will never legally be allowed to buy a cigarette or a vape. I think that phasing out over time is a sound approach instead of just drawing a line in the sand and expecting people to change their behavior
Mm.
overnight. I think that phased approach is better.
And as for the long term health harms, my experience of not just parenting teenagers, but seeing teenagers as patients is it's often not something that's front of mind. And I've often made reference to the fact that up until really you hit 30, you can get away with an awful lot. You can eat crap, you can sleep on a washing line, drink, some of the worst alcoholic cocktails, and you can still get up for work the next day. It's only when you get later on in life that you realize actually health takes a bit of effort. So I can see that the using the health angle with teenagers is probably not going to land. If you found that, would
Yeah, unless they're particularly sporty. So really sporty kids who maybe play on the football
mm,
team or the netball team, they're less interested in vaping because they're far more conscious of their health, maybe. But for the general population, yes,
mm,
they're going to live forever. So they're indestructible.
yeah, yeah. So we've got the personality profile of somebody who's perhaps a little bit rebellious, willing to experiment, maybe got older siblings or older cool friends, and they are the pack leader, so to speak, in the school. So does the program, and we could talk a little bit more next about the program itself and what it delivers, but does it in any way uh, lean into those particular personality characteristics, or is it quite standardized for everybody
We
that goes
talk
through it?
about, instead of different personality types, we talk about different types of influence and pressure. So we talk about, you know, I know when I was at school, the talk was all about peer pressure. And what we see far more is peer influence. It's far more subtle and nuanced than that. And also that young people put a lot of pressure on themselves. Nobody is necessarily telling them to
Mm,
vape or smoke, but they feel that they should to fit in, exactly what you said, sometimes for curiosity.
mm,
We know that vapes look and smell to some people appealing. Um, so it's
mm.
more about what the program does is it taps into each individual, looking at what their intrinsic motivators are. So what would make you say no if you were offered a vape or a cigarette? Your reason might be the same as your friends. It might be completely different, and that's absolutely fine. But it is looking at what motivates individuals to make good choices.
So let's talk about the program specifically then, so that people can get a feel for the fact that it exists and how it would work in a school that has. So, from what my understanding is, the schools can buy it directly, but it tends to come through public health, who then put the program into a
That's
number of
right.
schools. Is that
So,
right?
you know, at the very beginning, you talked about, the role of prevention, and successive governments, different political parties always bang the drum for prevention. Of course, they do. Early intervention is far more cost effective in the long run. And actually, we don't want young people taking up, more risky behaviors. The challenge is that the funding tends to be around things like cessation, because what what we know in the public sector is that people like to have a measure of success, and they like to measure
Mm,
success fairly quickly. So if somebody gives up smoking, that's a big tick in the box. That money was well spent. What
mm,
we're saying is, if these young people participate in this program now, in 30 or 40 years' time, over a quarter of them won't go on to try these things. Now, that's massive in public health
yeah.
terms, but it's not a crowd pleaser in any current political
Mm,
term.
yeah.
So, public health teams, public health in local authorities, where they can find the money to fund a license, and then they make that freely available to schools. So I would encourage
Mm,
all schools to either contact us or their local public health team, because they may or may not be aware that it's actually going on in their area, and it doesn't cost them a penny to get involved if the local authority are doing it.
mm, mm. Okay. Yeah, it's an interesting point, and I've made this several times in many meetings over the years. In that, how do we how do we prove that a project has
Mhm.
saved money, and then capture that money to reinvest it to continue to prevent that intervention? And I mean, a topical thing at the moment, obviously, is weight loss injections, and if there was significant investment now in weight loss injections, they would pay for themselves 10 times over just on the diabetes prevention alone. But the problem is there isn't that money, and the years it would take to recover the costs just mean that it's a great idea, but it doesn't come into reality. And prehab, I've talked about getting people a bit fitter before they have surgery, and the less time they'd spend in hospital, the less infections, the less readmissions, etc. But it's all theoretical, and like you say, showing that somebody has stopped something, showing somebody gets sent home from A&E rather than getting admitted, you can put in a tick in a box and you can count that. So I think that problem of prevention, and evidencing the money that it saves years down the line is perpetual.
Yeah,
We
and I think
struggle with that.
we know as well that I think the average, adult smoker takes around 7 quit attempts to give up. So it's not even measuring that one
Mhm.
attempt has closed that
Yeah.
down. It's repeated attempts, which actually for resilience and self-esteem is really challenging anyway. So it's not even an effective measure always.
Yeah, yeah. And let's remember, because we haven't mentioned that nicotine, I believe, you can correct me if you know different, but is if one of the, if not the most addictive substances known to man in terms of gram per gram. It is incredibly addictive. And I don't know that we necessarily appreciate that in
It's
everyday
interesting when we
life.
work with young people and we say, or they find out, nicotine is as addictive as heroin or cocaine. One of the first questions they ask is, well, how can you buy cigarettes and vapes then if it's that addictive? Good
Mm.
question. Part of what the
Mm.
program does
Yeah.
is it challenges young people to flip things over, to actually think about the mechanisms that go on in order to get them to do these behaviors. It's not just product
Yeah.
placement. There are lots of things that go on in the background, because tobacco and vape companies have huge budgets, all designed to
Yeah.
sort of tempt people in, if you like.
Absolutely. And they make very generous donations to political parties in exchange for favours. I mean, anybody who isn't aware of that is probably living under a rock. But so coming back to the programme then, so a school decides that, yep, we're going to launch this. This is going to run. So give us a flavour of what's happening in that school then with
Okay,
that
so
programme.
the program, as we said, it goes from year 7 to year 10. So it's 2 to 3 sessions per year of 1 hour each. So quite short. It goes across the PSHE curriculum so that we know that it actually meets learning objectives. It's not just an additional thing that we're asking teachers to do. They have to cover this content anyway. It's delivered around the interactive whiteboard, which parents will probably be aware of these days. So it's really easy. It's not like the olden days. I used to be a teacher, Lynette, when you were photocopying a gazillion sheets of paper for a lesson. It's log on, off we go. The activities involve quizzes, they involve video clips, there is some information, we look at case studies, we do some visualization, getting young people to think about their own lives as young adults. How do they want that life to be? So it's not a conventional, let's just sit and go through an exercise. There's a couple of information activities, and then the USP, this personal plan that young people do, where they're thinking about their own reasons to not vape and smoke. So they think about where are they tempted? How are they tempted? What are the things that they could bring up in relation to saying no? Why would you say no? Is it because maybe your parents vape and there's never any spare cash around? Is it because actually you've got asthma? Few children have said that to me. It would exacerbate their asthma. Is it because you don't like the smell? Is it because you don't want to be like the crowd? Unlikely, but so the teacher sort of scaffolds that discussion really. And then on their personal plan, they're committing to where they will try and remain or become, if they've already started dabbling, vape and smoke free. So it's that repeated, we call it a temptation battle plan, a bit like as adults, if you're going, we talked about a buffet earlier, you're going out for a meal, it's a buffet, and you might think, oh, God, I'm just going to go up once, it's planning in advance what you're going to do when you're faced with temptation. And the science behind it says that by writing that down, in the moment when temptation occurs, it's easier to stand firm.
Yeah. And I think we can extrapolate that to so many different examples. And I recorded a podcast episode with Jess Wall from Chimp Management, and I make no secret of my devotion to the chimp paradox model. And one of the questions I put to her was, the topic was, why is it so hard to change your habits? It is really hard, but being specific about what you will do in a particular situation that you know is going to be challenging, whether that's you've made a commitment, you're going to cut down your alcohol, but you've got 2 social events at the weekend. It's not enough to work with your own brain and the neuroscience. It's not enough to just say, well, I'm just not going to drink. You need to be more specific and give yourself a plan as to what you are going to drink and how many and whether you're going to drive. And that increases the chances of success quite significantly. It's still not 100%, as I'm sure you're probably seeing with the program, but it sounds like it's those same principles of spending some time to think about what you want and the why, and writing it down moves it from one circuit of your brain to another. And you are more likely to be able to follow that through if you've gone through that
Exactly. And we call that behavior change methodology implementation intentions. So it's what you intend to implement, in the moment. And by repeating that over the 4 years of the program, you're sort of trying to wire that into your brain, as an auto response. And yes, as you say, it works for 25% of young people, but not all young people, as you would expect.
Yeah, I don't know that we've got an intervention that works with 100% of people at any age. Until we are all AI bots, that is just going to be the challenge of human beings.
The other thing as well is in years 7 and 8 of the program, when the students are younger, we're very much looking at the nuts and bolts of vapes and tobacco and the number of chemicals in a cigarette or the components of a vape and the effects on different areas of your life. But as they move through year 9 and 10, we're thinking a lot more about exam stress, girlfriend, boyfriend stress, parent stress. How do you manage these challenges of teenage life without depending on a vape or a cigarette to get you through it? We also tell young people, because it's interesting, the dopamine reward system in your brain. Why do you need a vape or a cigarette? You need it because you're craving the nicotine, because your nicotine levels have decreased. And then you get that pow in your brain when you have another hit of nicotine. So we're trying to help them understand the physiology of addiction and dependency as well, so
Mm,
they can make sense of it. Because, one of the
mm,
biggest myths for
mm.
adults, I think, and young people around these behaviors are that they cure stress. Have a vape, you'll feel less stress. Well, maybe if you didn't vape, you wouldn't need a vape to top up your nicotine. And so it goes on.
Yeah. Yeah, I think the reasons for starting are not necessarily the
Yes.
reasons for continuing. Yeah, when you've got an addictive substance in the mix. I can always remember years ago, you've just made me think back to when I started work. I worked in my gap year between A level and university as a healthcare assistant in a local hospital. And the smokers would always be able to nip off for a fag break. There was a smoking room in the hospital. And as a non smoker, it pissed me off because there was work to be done. And I used to think, well, why do you just get to disappear for 5 minutes? And I'd never really considered until recently that, yeah, it is a little break from the intensity of a really busy ward. And then I read a book a while ago called Breath by James Nestor, which sounds breath or breathe, I can't remember. Anyway, it's all about breathing, which I didn't think for a minute I would get anything from this book, but it was really interesting. And it made me think about the the inadvertent breath work that smokers and now vapors are doing by stopping and deliberately focusing on their breathing, not in the way that somebody who's doing it for meditative reasons or deliberately to try and calm themselves down. But we know that you have a better chance of activating your parasympathetic nervous system if you control your breathing. And I often think that smoking and vaping, it gets wrapped up in some of that, pausing for a break, taking a step back, controlling your breathing. The problem is there's all these bloody chemicals that get lumped in with it, which we just don't know what they're doing further down the line. If we could have an intervention that says
Yeah,
everybody gets
absolutely.
to stop for a breath break, maybe that could be a very cheap
Well, and we know as
alternative.
well in schools, if you're addicted to nicotine, you're going to get crotchety, aren't you? If you're in a lesson, you're losing interest because actually you
Mm,
just want to have a puff on your vape. You and that's distracting. It can in some schools result in poorer behavior. And I'm sure some of the people listening to this will have read about nicotine pouches on the BBC website, or other websites are available. And actually, that's even more covert than vaping, because you just tuck one under your lip, between your lip and your gum, and you're getting that
mm,
nicotine hit whilst sitting in class and nobody even knows. So we cover that on the program because wherever we go, big tobacco is ahead of us. We're always playing catch up in
mm,
public health to mitigate these behaviors and these new substances, or delivery
mm,
methods, really, for nicotine.
mm. What have you heard when you've been in schools from the head teachers, the people about their difficulties in managing it? What's the kind of messaging officially or unofficially from schools about what a nightmare
I
this
mean,
is?
we know that schools tend to confiscate vapes. Confiscation is the way to, I guess, remove the problem in the short term. And I think, you know,
Mm,
whatever behavior we're talking about, there's always that contradiction between home and school, where you can do so much in school, but then you can't influence what goes on at home.
yeah.
Hence, I think parents don't necessarily know where to go with vaping. Not all parents, so they're hoping
Mm,
schools can tackle it. Um, I think obviously where you have something like vaping or smoking, young people congregate, don't they? It's a sociable, it's a habitual thing.
mm,
And I don't think schools want to see that, outside school or on the
mm,
playground. Or I know, well, I've read in the news about toilets being closed a lot of the school day now to stop kids going in and vaping. Schools investing in vape detectors, to put in the toilets. So,
mm,
well, I don't know where it ends really. It's easier just to stop them starting. So schools, I guess,
mm,
by doing intent, you're saving yourself work in the longer term, by fitting in these sessions now,
mm,
because we know that, yeah, especially post pandemic, attainment is a massive driver, because it slipped back in lockdown. And understandably, timetables are chock a block these days, with all the different subjects and
mm,
the pressures on schools. So sometimes it feels hard to give time to something that is, you know, not academic in nature, but I think it has an
yeah.
effect on academic attitude and behaviour.
Mm. Yeah, and I by no means expecting that schools
Yeah,
should have the answer to this.
absolutely.
I speak to a lot of teenage teachers. I sign a lot of teachers off, and they
Yeah,
are overwhelmed with extracurricular things that they end up having to deal with. And I'd love to say that involving families or making families aware when this program is running would be great. And it would for those families
yeah,
that are motivated. But there are lots of families that won't read the letters that come home from school and have just literally gone, yeah, school, you need to deal with that. And so it isn't easy by any means, but it is quite rightly a program that's got good evidence to show this
mhm,
has good results. And from from my understanding, low
yeah.
intervention and low cost when you think about what it
Yeah,
tends to
intent can
say.
cost about 50 pence per student per year. And also,
Mm,
often things in schools, they're a quick hit. It's a session on something. This 4 years builds incrementally, so the content
mm,
evolves as the young people mature, so that it's age appropriate. So they're getting these reinforced messages for 4 years, which also I think contributes to the effectiveness.
mm,
It's not a one term affair; it's 4 years of evidence based information.
mm, mm. What do you want people to do more of, or what do you think, given what, because what you hear from the students in schools running this program will be very different from what they go home and say.
Yeah.
And you're a mum, I'm a mum. And what do you think parents could do? I wouldn't say better, but differently.
I think, my son, probably like your kids, when you ask them what they've done at school, what they've learned, they usually say nothing.
Mm,
Or it's boring.
yeah.
It's a stock response. It's maybe unpicking that a bit and saying, really, what did you find
Mm,
out about? Or if
mm,
school sends a letter home, asking about, well, how was that course? I piloted, actually, we've just done some
mm,
year 6 sessions for primary schools, and I piloted them in a friend's school where she teaches, and we ran focus groups in my son's school. It's really interesting when you talk to kids, and this is year 6 primary, how much they know, you know, and also the sort of
mm,
misconceptions they've picked up. And I think it's having those
mm,
conversations, but maybe not pummeling them for information. I like chatting in the car or when we're out for a walk, so it doesn't feel
mm.
like an interview. Yeah,
So intense.
yeah. So I think it's trying to engage
Mm,
with what schools are doing. I think it's looking
mm,
for opportunities if you see stories on the news or online and actually flagging that if your kids are teenagers. Because sometimes, well, we know it's
mm,
more powerful if it comes from other people, not from us as parents, I think,
mm.
as a rule.
Yeah. And is there much talk about the role that social media has? Because I think as parents, we are very quick to blame social media for lots of things. But what I tend to have to remind myself and other people of is that no two
Yeah.
people's feed looks the same. And I genuinely don't know how much exposure online young people are getting to the potential harms of smoking and vaping. Do they share anything when you're working with them about this? Because I guarantee they're not seeing the adverts that I'm seeing
I
on my
think there are
feed.
trends. So my son is too young for social media, but he loves gaming. So if a gamer is smoking or vaping or even product placement, where they can't directly now promote smoking, but they can have a box of cigarettes
Mm,
in the background. That's hugely powerful.
mm,
It's not just what they listen to, it's what they see, I think. And I do think social media normalizes vaping. And I've
mm,
watched those videos where young people, they save every disposable vape they had and they line them up all around their bed. It's this cornucopia of color and sparkle, and it's a thing in the same way that people used to modify vapes. They were called mods, so that you could take in far more vapor, more nicotine, and then you could blow huge vape rings with them. There are, and things like that just catch on. It's a bit of a sort of
mm,
thing to do to see if you can beat the other person who did it. Can you make a bigger, better one? So I can see the appeal in that. And I think, some of the work we do is we talk about, why are people like footballers, Premiership footballers, why are they fined if they're seen or packed smoking drinking on a night out before a game because they're role models. We talk about, not everybody in the public eye does this stuff, but our attention is drawn to the people who do, isn't it? As young people, we see what we want to see, I think.
Yeah, you've just reminded me of a point about the smokiness of these things, or the amount of vape and cloud. And it was my husband that explained to me that you can vary the amount of vape that is produced from the vapes, and there's almost a level of desirability among the more smoky ones. I just wasn't aware of all of this, but he works in a prison, and so he's aware of a lot of the conversation that goes on around it, and some of the elaborate gadgets that you can use. So there's almost become a prestige associated with some of them I was completely unaware of. I mean, I have to say, it makes me feel a bit old and a bit ignorant, because I am a bit clueless about it, in fairness.
I think there's a sort of reliance almost of parents being a bit behind the curve, because if we were all over this stuff, then it would probably be easier to maybe encourage our young people to make different choices. But often we get caught out down the line because it just happens, doesn't it? It just appears from nowhere almost. It feels like it's overnight when it isn't, but it feels like it is sometimes.
Yeah. And we don't know. I think a point probably to close on is that, like you said at the beginning, this is not harmless. And I'll make the same point about alcohol. There is no safe level of alcohol. There's just a level at which it will do some people harm. But I'm not going to start trying to say that to teenagers en masse either, because I can imagine the eye rolling would be off the scale. But I do think this is a problem that needs to be taken more seriously. And do we have, you may not have this data to hand, it's certainly not a test, but I'm curious if we've got any data on the number of people that are still converting to smoking further down the line from vaping, particularly in their teens and 20s. Have we got any handle on that?
I did read, actually, again, ASH is a brilliant source of information for parents. ASH is...
What's ASH?
There's ASH Scotland. ASH is the England version, but it's the tobacco anti-smoking organisation, but it's all public health, evidence-based. They run campaigns. Really good source of information, fact sheets for parents, for young people. They carry out surveys, which is where we get a lot of our information. So I read in the ASH newsletter this week, actually, that the number of young people who have ever smoked, so who have tried smoking, has increased from 14% in 2023 to 21% in 2025. What do we know? Do we suspect that when vapes, move over to plain packaging, when legislation changes around vapes, will that push young people back onto tobacco or not? We don't know. But, I think we mustn't take our eye off the ball. There is rightly a focus on vaping with young people because we don't want them to vape or smoke, but we also need to keep an eye on tobacco use in the background because it's still available, to young people. But I do think, going back to what you said, this misinformation, it's really important in public health terms to reinforce that, yes, vaping is less harmful. Lots of young people think that it's as dangerous or more dangerous as cigarettes, and we certainly don't want them choosing cigarettes because they think that's a better option. We just don't want them to do either. That's our messaging for young people. Although some local authorities now are setting up quit support services for young people.
Yeah, after the horse has bolted again, as we've said. Okay, so Sally, your programme is available, and as a kind of closing line, how would, if the head teacher was listening to this, or somebody working for an integrated care board who's got access to a public health budget, thought that actually this is really needed in our area because we can see this is a problem, or it's something they want to deal with, what would they do next?
They would go to our website, which is www.evidencetoimpact.com, and they can find out more about intent there. There's an intent tab. They could Google, actually, intent vaping and smoking prevention program. We would come up, and then they can just drop us a contact form, or my phone number's on there. Actually, they can give me a ring.
Okay, great. So if anybody listening feels that this is something that they could make use of, and I would encourage them to think about it, or send the
Yes.
episode to
Yes.
somebody with a bit of clout, for them to have a listen and think about, because the more low cost early interventions that can become normal, we will all reap the benefits further down the line, because we're all paying the price of the consequences of this further down the line. It's not somebody else's problem. It's our collective issue, isn't it, as a
It is.
society, to look after the health
The
of our
evidence
nation.
tells us that even if you delay, for example, the uptake of smoking, it means that as adults, people smoke less heavily for fewer years. So there's a role to play
Mm,
just in delaying these risk behaviors, even if you can't prevent them. So
mm,
if we delay young people from starting these things, we're still building in healthy habits for more years.
yeah, good stuff. Sally, thanks very much. I really hope that somebody picks up the
Thanks,
baton.
This has been a Monkey Pants Productions podcast.